So, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the University of Notre Dame, Australia. My name is David Bronstein. I'm an associate professor here at Notre Dame and one of the co-directors, along with Dr. Nathan Lyons, of the Notre Dame Center for the History of Philosophy, and I will be your MC this evening. I'm very, very excited to welcome you to the launch of the Center for the History of Philosophy and the inaugural lecture to be delivered by Therese Cory, the John and Jean Oesterle Associate Professor of Thomistic Studies at Notre Dame University in the United States. Before we get underway, I'll just kindly ask you to please switch your mobile phones to silent and note that in the event of an emergency, please follow the direction of the university event staff. Thank you. Now, the University of Notre Dame, Australia is proud to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land upon which our university sits. The university acknowledges that the Sydney campus, where we meet tonight, is located on Gadigal country. The Fremantle campus is on Whadjuk country, and the Broome campus on Yawuru country. Now, I would like now to introduce Donna Ingram to deliver the welcome to country.
Good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here with permission from my elders to offer you welcome to country for the University of Notre Dame Centre for the History of Philosophy launch. It gives me pride to represent my community in this important cultural protocol. It shows respect for and recognition to the unique position of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australian culture and history. I'm an Aboriginal woman who proudly identifies with the Wiradjuri Nation from Central West New South Wales. I was born on Gadigal land and I've had the privilege to live, work and raise my 4 children on this land for most of my life. My family has grown and I'm now a proud grandmother to Aaliyah, Elijah, Kalila Lakurta, Jake Jr., Aki and baby Kate. My wish for my grandchildren is to grow up happy and healthy in a safe and inclusive society where they have equal access to quality educational experiences so that their dreams can come true. I acknowledge the Gadigal, their spirits and ancestors who will always remain with the land Mother Earth, and I thank them for their ongoing custodianship. I pay my respects to our elders both past and present, and we must never forget the sacrifices made by our leaders to create a better future for Aboriginal people. I do this as a reminder and as a tribute to elders and those who have gone before us to fight for land rights, justice and equity for our communities. I extend my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from all clans and nations who are present this evening. I also recognise our non-Aboriginal sisters and brothers from all backgrounds who walk beside us to share knowledge and ideas. I now offer you a warm and sincere welcome to the land of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. Wish you a safe stay on the land and safe travel from the land. On behalf of my community and the Gadigal, I wish you all a great evening at this lecture, hearing from Associate Professor Therese Cory from Notre Dame, USA, in her talk, The Mind as Part of Nature in Thomas Aquinas. I also wish the Centre all the best in exploring some of the deepest and oldest questions about reality and human life. It sounds fascinating. In closing, we remember that this is, was, and always will be Aboriginal land. Thanks, everyone. Have a beautiful evening.
Thank you very much, Donna, for that warm welcome. So it's now my pleasure to introduce University Chaplain Father Reginald Chua to lead us in the University prayer.
Thank you so much, David and Aunty Donna. And it's an honour to begin this evening with prayer to Notre Dame, to Our Lady. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Notre Dame, Mother of Jesus and our Mother, we ask you to guide our university. Mary, as you cared for Jesus, show a loving care for us. As we expand our minds in study and research, as we open our hearts to future possibilities, and extend our hands to those who are in need. Mary, seat of wisdom, teach us to care for the land and the people, of this country of the Southern Cross. In this academic community dedicated to you, help us to find new yet faithful ways of bringing the message of Jesus to Australia and to those who share this region of the earth with us. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Father Reginald. And it's now my pleasure to welcome our Chancellor, the Honourable Christopher Ellison.
Well, thank you, David, for being our MC tonight and for the introduction. With Professor Francis Campbell, our Vice-Chancellor, may I welcome you all to this auspicious occasion tonight, and that is the launch of the Centre for the History of Philosophy. And what an exciting event it is. But firstly, thank you, Father Reg, for the prayer, and particularly when you recall praying to Mary's Seat of Wisdom, and how apt that is for what we're doing tonight. And Aunty Donna, who's been a great supporter of our university and well known to the Notre Dame University, thank you for the welcome to country, and we look forward to your grandchildren coming here. Well, you know, we start young, but thank you very, very much. And in particular, a special welcome to our American friends, Professor Therese, Cory, and also Professor Sean Kelsey from Notre Dame. And when we say Notre Dame, you know, we're talking about Indiana, South Bend. And when it's Notre Dame, it's here. But it's fantastic to have you here. And Therese, we look forward to your address later on in relation to Thomas Aquinas. We also have with us tonight a director from our board, Hilary Johnson-Croak. Great to have you here, Hilary. And we also have a governor, Tony Shannon, who's here tonight and been a great supporter of the university. Whilst I'm on the issue of governance and the leadership of this university, a particular thank you to Terry Tobin, who's here tonight with Bernadette. Terry served as the 4th Chancellor of Notre Dame and has remained ever since a great supporter and friend of Notre Dame. And we thank you, Terry, for the advice you give us and the great support you give us. And, of course, what you've done over the time you've been involved so intimately with the university. We also have the Honourable James Griffin, the MP for Manly and Shadow Minister, who's also part of our alumni. Great to have James here tonight supporting the university. And, of course, Paul McClintock, the Chair of St Vincent Health, a very important stakeholder for Notre Dame. And you'll find that across the country, this university has fantastic links with hospitals and particularly Catholic healthcare. But I mentioned the leadership we have, and I just want to signal the great leadership shown to us by our Vice-Chancellor. Thank you, Francis, for the leadership you've shown this university, and to all the staff that have done such a great job making us the great university we are today. But in particular, thank you for those who've been instrumental in bringing about this great day today. And we'll touch on that now, because the history of philosophy is not something you find in every university. And this academic discipline is about carrying on a conversation with thinkers of the past about the big questions in human life in the hope of finding wisdom for our present and future. And in particular, one thing that I was struck by was that the mention of the discovery of what past philosophical texts, thinkers and traditions spoke of, and how they can speak to us today. And I was reminded of our graduations for medical students, where we cite Hippocrates. And Hippocrates said, wherever you find the practice of medicine, you'll find the love of humanity. And all those centuries ago, that was espoused, and how true it is today. And I think that is indeed a reflection of what we're seeing today with this centre. Can I say, our researchers, and I mentioned the staff involved, our co-directors, Associate Professor David Bronstein and also Dr. Nathan Lyons, in bringing this about, but also with others, and we'll come to the background shortly, but what I think we're going to see from this centre is going to be something which we just haven't previously expected or thought of. And I think that in the state we find our world and this country of ours, something of this nature is sorely needed. And so, well done to all those who've brought this together and who will drive it forward. But a little bit about the origin of the centre. In 2022, David and Nathan received a major ARC research fellowship. David was awarded the Future Fellowship and Nathan the Discovery Early Career Researcher Award. And these were the first such awards given to Notre Dame in its history. So really groundbreaking stuff. Building on the momentum of this funding, they decided to pursue the establishment of a new centre, and that was to research the history of philosophy. Well, they received an internal award, Big Ideas. It was a scheme announced to bring these sorts of things into the open and get them started, and that with the support of our Pro-Vice Chancellor Research, Professor Aaron Murphy, and also Dr. Anne Pizzarol, Head of Research, Development and Innovation, it managed to get some legs. And so we started to see it grow and develop. And it wasn't long after a few internal pathways, hurdles had been negotiated, we got to the point that we're at the moment. And I think that this centre is very much aligned with our mission as a university. And so we have researchers in the centre who have expertise across the ancient, medieval and modern periods of the Western intellectual tradition. So important, as I say, in the times we face today. Well, the scholars involved in the centre have produced world-class research and published with top book presses and academic journals. We've got a strong record of winning competitive grants, always important, with major funding bodies such as the ARC I mentioned and the John Templeton Foundation. With many more achievements to come, we look forward to that growing, and the university will work hard at raising those funds and the philanthropic contribution that we need. As I mentioned, the partnership with the University of Notre Dame in Indiana is so important, and we have the collaboration with the internationally esteemed History of Philosophy Forum. The History of Philosophy Forum is the world's leading history of philosophy research centre, and we're very fortunate for this partnership, which involves joint research projects, grant seeking, co-sponsored events, and faculty and student exchanges. And so what we see here is a strengthening of the relationship between Notre Dame and Notre Dame. Well, I mentioned Professor Therese Cory, who is a John and Jean Oesterle Associate Professor of Thomistic Studies and Director of the History of Philosophy Forum, which I mentioned. With a special interest in Thomas Aquinas, we look forward in hearing from Therese this evening and her talk about, well, the title is The Mind as Part of Nature in Thomas Aquinas. The school I went to was Trinity College, which was a rival to Aquinas College. So I'll be very interested to see how he thought, because we're always trying to work out how the Aquinians thought. But we also have, from Notre Dame, I mentioned Professor Sean Kelsey, who is the Reverend John A. O'Brien College Professor of Philosophy and brings expertise in ancient Greek philosophy. And it was just 2 weeks ago in Sydney that this university gave an honorary doctorate of divinity to the Patriarch of Constantinople at St. Mary's Cathedral. And I think that too was a remarkable milestone in the university's history. So, great achievement, great effort, and a great future to come in what is something which is very close to the the very ethos of our university. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the great support you give our universities, and we look forward to your address, Therese. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chancellor. I now invite my co-director, the Notre Dame Center for the History of Philosophy, Dr. Nathan Lyons, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, David. Therese Scarpelli Cory is the John and Jean Oesterle Associate Professor of Thomistic Studies at the University of Notre Dame, USA. As we've heard, at Notre Dame, she's also the director of the Maritain Centre and the History of Philosophy Forum, which is a partner with our new centre here at Notre Dame, Australia. Therese is a medieval philosophy specialist. Her research investigates the ways that medieval thinkers in the Latin and Arabic tradition conceptualised the mind, and one of her primary research interests is Thomas Aquinas, along with other major medieval figures such as Albert the Great and Bonaventure. She's the author of a major monograph in the field, Aquinas on Human Self-Knowledge, published by Cambridge University Press in 2013. Now, I was asked 5 minutes ago if the books up the back are for sale. The answer is that they're not. However, if anyone was willing to offer 6 figures, Therese would be willing to sell a signed copy of that book, and perhaps we would split the revenue from that sale. Now, not only is Therese a brilliant scholar, and she is, she's also an awe-inspiring academic leader and administrator. 4 weeks ago, Therese led a conference at Notre Dame, US called Aquinas at 800, commemorating the 800th anniversary of Thomas Aquinas' birth in 1224. Her conference had 600 participants from 20 countries and over 150 speakers, making it no doubt the largest Thomistic event ever and one of the most significant academic events in the history of philosophy in recent memory. As well as an indicator of Aquinas' continuing significance, this event is a mark of Therese's standing as a world leader in Thomistic studies today. David and I are actually running a conference at the moment for 2 days that has 7 speakers. And I don't know about you, David, but the number of emails that we've sent for 7 speakers has been quite enough, and I'll need to sit in a room in the dark for a week after this is all done. But Therese, the indefatigable, jumped on a plane to Australia to join us today, and we're very grateful. Therese is one of the most creative and important living interpreters of the work of Thomas Aquinas, and it's my pleasure to welcome her to deliver our centre's launch lecture tonight. The title of her lecture is The Mind as Part of Nature in Thomas Aquinas. Please join me in welcoming Therese Cory.
Thank you so much, Nathan, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to David as well for the invitation to be here. I'm so happy to be here at the launch of the Center for the History of Philosophy here at the University of Notre Dame. I'm grateful to the Chancellor and Vice Chancellor also for being able to be part of this very special occasion. Thank you for having me here. I particularly want to congratulate David and Nathan on this remarkable achievement. I think this is a great step forward for research in the history of philosophy. I understand it's the first center dedicated to the history of philosophy in Australia. That's a great thing for the country. And I'm very excited about the partnership that we're building between the History of Philosophy Forum at the University of Notre Dame in the US and the Center for the History of Philosophy. So we've had David out to visit earlier this year for a wonderful discussion of a book project that he's working on Aristotle. Next year we're planning a joint conference with the University of Leuven and the University of Notre Dame and Notre Dame. It's going to be at our campus. And we're hoping that this is eventually going to develop into a larger institutional network of institutions that are committed fundamentally to the history of philosophy. So there are exciting things afoot, and I'm very much looking forward to what we can accomplish together. And I also want to express gratitude to the University of Notre Dame, Australia, for supporting this venture. The institutional support for these sorts of projects is so critical. And it's very important for this particular field, I think, to have visible structures to bring together researchers. I always tell my students that in the history of philosophy, there's no one person who can know everything that you need to know in order to do your own research at the top level. You really need to depend on a whole community of scholars, each of whom is filling in these various pieces for each other. So the whole is really greater than the sum of its parts in the history of philosophy, and so there's a kind of amplification that happens when we have these centers of research that allow us to collaborate together and to share our ideas. I'm also particularly proud to see this step being taken by the University of Notre Dame as a fellow Catholic university. And I wanted to say something before I begin to talk about why the history of philosophy is so central, even mission critical for Catholic universities like Notre Dame and Notre Dame. And the reason I think is that Catholic and Christian theology has a long and venerable tradition that's developed over the course of 2 millennia of reflection. During that period, it's had a quite positive relationship with the various philosophical traditions that have grown up in the surrounding cultures. And of course, there's ups and downs, but going back to the early days of Christianity, you can find a pattern of enthusiasm for the resources that philosophers provide for understanding God's creation and salvific activity. So if you're familiar with Augustine, the way that he gorgeously recalls the truths he learned from the Neoplatonists that helped him to think about good and beauty and the transcendence of God on his journey toward faith. And this has had the important result that most of history's greatest philosophical thinkers have been enormously influential in shaping the Catholic tradition, regardless of whether they themselves were Christians at all. So you can think of Greek and Roman thinkers like Aristotle's theory of accidents, which is important for the doctrine of the Eucharist, or Cicero and the concept of natural law. You could think about Kant, Hegel, and Husserl's influence on the phenomenological tradition, from which John Paul II developed his theory of Christian personalism. You could think about medieval Jewish and Muslim thinkers, Maimonides and his role in the concept of divine transcendence. And one of my favorite examples is that if you look up the beatific vision, the soul's vision of God after death, in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, you'll see this quote. It reads, "Because of his transcendence, God cannot be seen as he is unless he himself opens up his mystery to man's immediate contemplation and gives him the capacity for it." And that phrase, gives him the capacity for it, it comes originally from Aquinas, but it is the echo of an idea that goes back to the Muslim philosopher Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, to Cordoba about 1,000 years ago. And that echo of that idea is still detectable in Catholic theology today. And I think this is a great example of the way that the history of philosophy can mediate the cooperation of people from different places and times, even across far distant generations in a common pursuit of truth. And the possibility of this kind of cooperation is something the Catholic tradition is fundamentally committed to. So it's wonderful to see a fellow Catholic university taking this important step to support and promote the history of philosophy. So thank you for that. Okay, so now to begin my paper, and I have a handout which is on your seats that contains some of the basic claims in the paper and some key texts. How far does the realm of nature extend? Suppose we're on a hike and we make an inventory of the things we're experiencing and observing. We might mention the bright sunshine or the warmth of the breeze, trickling water, large animals rustling in the bushes, chirping crickets, things like that. But would it occur to us to include our own thinking minds on that list? And I think for many of us it would not. In fact, we have a tendency to think of the mind as something isolated that occupies its own realm apart from the natural world, something that's hard to understand and not really part of our own daily experience. So Augustine says, quote, "The mind has difficulty being with itself. People go long distances to wonder at great mountains and huge tides and the vast breadths of the sea and the horizon of the oceans and the circling of the stars." I know I was doing that yesterday here in Sydney. But they forget about themselves. end quote. So consider all the ways in which we drive a wedge between our own mind and the, quote, natural world. First, there's the tendency of philosophers to put mind in a separate realm of its own, so that we end up using totally different concepts for explaining mind versus nature. So when we analyze kangaroos or crickets, we will use concepts like causes, teleology, forms, material structures, tendencies, forces, laws of nature. But when we talk about thoughts, we reach for a whole different set of conceptual tools. We speak of ideas, representations, intentionality, judgments, truth and falsity. And this is true not just of professional philosophers, but even in our ordinary talk. So if we try to talk about the mind in the same way that we talk about the natural world, we can't help sliding into talk of the brain. One minute we describe from the inside our thoughts, feelings, or perceptions, but if we start trying to provide an explanation in terms of causes and effects, structures, etc., we'll immediately find ourselves stepping outside the mind to talk about neurons. And so, think about things that you tell small children. You might say, oh, you're hungry, so your brain is making you angry. So there's something extrinsic. A second aspect here is the tendency to treat anything mental as having diminished reality, or as though it just doesn't count metaphysically. So we'll say things like, it's all in his head, or it was mere fancy, as though that makes it less real. But the unreality of the mental has also been defended by philosophers historically in many different forms. So 14th century thinkers were already distinguishing between real being, esse reale, versus the being that things have in the mind, which they called intentional being, or esse intentionale. Or consider Kant's distinction between the thing as it is in itself as opposed to its phenomenon or appearance to a mind. All these tendencies go back to the same thing, the segregating of mind into a realm of its own apart from nature or the natural world. Mind is an interloper in the natural world, not part of it. Tonight I want to propose an alternative, which I argue is found in the writings of the medieval thinker Thomas Aquinas, and what I'm going to basically present to you is the overall argument from a book that I'm just finishing up on the metaphysics of mind in Aquinas. So what I want to argue is that for Aquinas, mind is not situated over and against nature. It is part of the natural world, or the world of natures. It is one of the natures that exist. This means that for Aquinas, any attempt to explain mind and its activities has to be an explanation in terms of the same kinds of concepts that we use to explain things like wallabies or trees. I actually just saw a wallaby, a real one, for the first time, so now I actually know what it looks like. If we understand a wallaby in terms of where it comes from and what it is made of, well, then the same is going to apply for Aquinas for our thoughts and experiences. We have to ask the question, what are thoughts made of? Where do they come from? And tonight I will try to explain how this alternative approach works in Aquinas. Namely, what does it mean to say that thought is a nature among other natures, and what kind of nature is it anyway? So let me do three things, necessarily rather briefly, given the constraints of time. First, I will highlight a widespread way of modeling thought as a mind-world connection, which I want to argue has prevented previous generations of readers from understanding Aquinas properly. Second, I want to unfold Aquinas' approach to thought as a kind of nature and explain what nature that is. And third, I want to show how, on this view, ordinary activities of learning and reasoning are not strictly information processing, but rather something more like an intellectual self-organization aiming for the mature shape that a human mind should have, just like a plant's growth into its mature shape. And just a note here, for Aquinas, when we use the term mind, we mean something very general in contemporary philosophy. And for Aquinas, that corresponds to a variety of different modalities of mind: vision, hearing, imagination, memory, and also intellectual thinking. But I'm only going to focus tonight on intellectual thinking, which is the activity of the power he calls intellect. And that's what's responsible for our ability to grasp the essences of things. So if you were to encounter a wallaby, if you have at that moment that you encounter it, an insight into it as a kind of thing, to understand it as belonging to a kind, it's your intellect that's responsible for that. All right, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. So first section, on spatial connective models of mind. So I want to ask the question of how the mind gets walled off in the first place into its own realm in this way, away from the natural world. And I think part of the reason lies in the way that philosophers have tended to model mental activities, namely the images that we reach for when we try to make sense of the activities of thinking. Much philosophy about the mind today, as well as among historical thinkers, has been guided by what I call spatial connective models of the mental. That means that the mind is being imagined as something like an inner space in which objects are being presented, or as an inner eye to which those objects are presented, or even as a kind of inner hand that reaches out to grasp objects. And correspondingly, mental activities are imagined as somehow connecting or relating the mind to its object. So such imagery does colorfully recur throughout the history of philosophy. We could think of Augustine, who speaks of the inner eye or the vast caverns of memory, or describes a mental attention that connects the soul with the things that it's thinking about. We could think of Descartes with his inner review of ideas, or Hume with his theater of ideas, which is what he calls the mind. And this imagery is familiar to us because we ordinarily talk in much the same way. We'll describe thinking as touching or seeing. So think of how many times you've said something like, I didn't grasp the idea, or now I see the point. But these images, I want to argue, are not mere innocent metaphors. They are the tip of the iceberg of a model of mind that is doing important theoretical work in the background, controlling how we set up the problems that a theory of thinking must answer, and constraining which solutions seem plausible to us. And the modeling of the mind as an inner space, I think, is especially important for understanding how the mind gets hustled off into its own realm apart from the natural world. If the mind is an inner space, then it becomes a world of its own, with its own inhabitants. You go into the wardrobe, and you find Narnia. Anything might be in there. And indeed, what we find in there in the space of the mind is not koalas or crickets, but something else entirely: ideas, sentiments, beliefs, or impressions. So along those lines, then, we come to imagine these two spaces, the inner and outer universes, as completely alien to each other, alternative dimensions that have nothing in common. But this sets up a kind of problem, and the problem is laid out on your handout here in this overly complicated diagram. Problem is this: well, we sense and think things in the outer universe, so clearly the inner and outer universe have to be in contact with each other somehow. But how? And the result is what I call a theory of thinking as connecting. We imagine it this way: mind is over here, world is over here. We model them as two independent and spatially located bodies that stand across from each other, separated by a distance. And then we model sensing or thinking as the relation or connection between those two bodies, the crossing of the spatial gap between these two things, two worlds. What contemporary philosophy calls the mind-world gap. Now, in the past, Aquinas has been read almost exclusively through the lens of this theory of thinking as connecting. So if you're familiar at all with the literature on Aquinas' theory of mind, it's extremely focused for the last 140 years. It's been very focused on questions about representationalism and realism, having to do with whether the mind is able to connect up directly to objects in the extramental world. But my view is that this whole discussion has been a mistake. Aquinas does not think of our intellectual activities in terms of connecting with intramental or extramental realities, but rather in terms of having mental being. So on his view, creatures have potentials for acquiring all sorts of different kinds of being: heat, color, muscle tone, etc. And as I read Aquinas, among the various kinds of being, there are also different kinds of mental being. There's visual being, the stuff of sight; auditory being, the stuff of hearing; imaginative being, the stuff of imagining, intellectual being, the stuff of thought, each of which has its own essential feel or what it is like. And our conscious experience consists in a patchwork that's made up of all of these different kinds of mental being in us. So our conscious experience for Aquinas, as I argue, does not consist in setting up the right sorts of connections to things that are other than us and outside. Rather, it consists in acquiring the right kinds of being. And I want to call this the theory of thinking as being. So let us see what that means. And this is section 2. The core idea here in Aquinas' metaphysics of intellect is that intellectuality is a kind of being among the other kinds of being that we encounter around us, and that therefore the story of how thinking happens can be told in terms of our acquiring a kind of being, just as the story of any change or development is told, for Aquinas, in terms of a substance gaining certain kinds of being, like a pot of water gaining heat, or skin getting sunburnt, or a leaf gradually changing into dirt. In other words, in order to understand how mind works for Aquinas, we need to look to changes in the natural world as models. So this might sound a bit counterintuitive and not how we usually think about it, so let's pause for a moment over that idea. How does Aquinas conceptualize natural changes like heating, getting a sunburn, or decomposing into dirt? His basic approach is to construe these changes as the addition or loss of different kinds of being for which something has a potential. So if I say that water is becoming hot, for Aquinas, that means that heat, a certain kind of being, is being added to it. And if I say that my skin is becoming sunburned, that means it has lost its pallor and gained redness. Or if I say that the leaf has decomposed into dirt, that is to say that a quantity of matter has lost leafness and acquired dirtness from one kind of being to the other. So Aquinas' picture of changes in the natural world is one in which subjects gain and lose different kinds of being, which either change fundamentally what they are, as in a leaf which becomes dirt, ceasing to be a leaf, or qualify how they are, as when my skin becomes reddened. So how does Aquinas apply this to the mind? The view I propose is this. When we think, we are gaining some new being that we did not have before, and that is intellectual being, which is the being of thought itself. To say that intellectuality is a kind of being is to say that it is a real natural stuff like heat or red or hardness. Now, Aquinas holds that we don't have intellectual being innately, but we do have powers for acquiring it. So if we compare to heat, by nature, fire is hot, but by nature, water only has a potential for heat. And similarly, the powers that we have by nature, what Aquinas calls the possible intellect and the agent intellect, are not already instances of intellectual being in us. Rather, they are the active and passive powers whereby intellectual being is realized in us. So when something is presented in the imagination, say again, a wallaby, the agent intellect abstracts a form, wallabiness, which is a likeness of the nature of wallabies. This is what Aquinas usually calls an intelligible species, which is received by the possible intellect in the way that matter receives form. And it is in that moment that intellectual being is actualized in me. That is the moment that I acquire the thought, wallaby. So Aquinas explains how intellectual being comes to be in us in his Disputed Questions De Veritate, question 8, article 6, which I think is on the handout, yeah. And this is a really wonderful text that actually was one of the key texts for medieval thinkers after Aquinas to engage with his theory of mind, but somehow dropped out of the discussion later, where people tended to focus more on his Summa Theologiae, but I think this is a very important text. So he says, there are two kinds of acts, and what is common to both is that they are performed only by something that actually exists, insofar as it is in act. For a body does not shine, nor does it illuminate, except insofar as it actually has light. And the thinker, insofar as she thinks, must be actual. But it is not the case that in the act of thinking, the thinker is the agent, and what is thought is the patient. Instead, the thinker and the thought become one thing, actual intellect, constituting a single principle of the act which is thinking. And in order for the intelligible to be united to the intellect, there must be some action or passion. There is an action, insofar as the agent intellect makes the species be actually intelligible, and a passion, insofar as the possible intellect receives the intelligible species. But the act of thinking follows upon this passion or action as an effect follows upon a cause. Therefore, just as the luminous body shines when light is actual in it, so too the intellect thinks whatever is actually intelligible in it. End quote. So there's a lot of jargon in there, but Aquinas displays his fundamentally metaphysical approach to conscious intellectual thought, I think, very nicely in this passage. So what we see here is that it is a kind of change that happens in a subject like any other natural change and occurring in just the same way. So the moment that I begin to know what wallabies are, my act of thinking is liable to the same kind of causal analysis as any other actions in the natural world, like boiling water heating an egg, or fire drying out wood, or the sun shining. In all such cases, in order to produce an action, the agent must acquire, if it does not already have, the relevant kind of being by means of acquiring a form. So too, in order to perform the act of thinking about wallabies, I must acquire intellectual being, which is realized in me when a form actualizes my potential for intellectual being. And we notice in this text that Aquinas describes the being that you need in order to perform an intellectual action as both intellectual being and intelligible being, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So by viewing intellectuality as a kind of being with its own proper kind of corresponding actions, Aquinas resists the tendency to treat the mental as though it is less real than any other nature. On this view, intellectual being is just as metaphysically weighty as any other kind of being in the natural world, and it comes to be in exactly the same way, through the reception of a form. And as a result, and I could say more about this, but this is just a summary, we should understand this intelligible species, or the abstracted form of wallabiness, also as a natural form like any other form. It is not a representation or a concept or a vehicle of mental content. Rather, it is the formal constituent of a new kind of being in us. Again, activities of thinking about something, judging or drawing conclusions are activities like any other in the natural world: heating, cooling, bleaching, shining. They are the completion of intellectual being, just as shining is the completion of luminous being, or heating is the completion of hot being. So what distinguishes intellectual being from other kinds of being in nature is not that it has a different structure or it lacks ontological significance, but rather that the kind of being it instantiates has a unique characteristic, namely it's self-manifesting, as we will now see. So let's take a closer look at this kind of being that Aquinas says that we acquire when we're performing intellectual actions. In the text above, he called it both intellectual and intelligible. And we might ask ourselves, how can it be both of those things at the same time? So I want to argue that this is not a slip on his part, because in fact, his view is that intellectual being just is intelligible being, that the thinking kind of actuality is also the being thought kind of actuality. Intellectuality and intelligibility are merely two sides of the same coin, two dimensions of a single kind of being. So he says, quote, "The actual intelligible is the actual intellect, but according as they are distinct from each other, both are merely potential." And this is an important difference from the way that Aquinas is often read on this point. There's a tendency to think about there being this identity between the intellect and the intelligible thing as an extramental thing in the world that we're somehow trying to connect with. And what I want to argue is that for Aquinas, instead, he thinks about what he's describing as one kind of being that's both intellectual and intelligible, thinking and thought. That's the kind of being we acquire when we begin to think. Okay. So this kind of being has two important features. First, for Aquinas, it is non-bodily in the sense that it is not extended. Second, so it doesn't have any dimensions. Secondly, it is intrinsically self-manifest. And we can see both of these features in one of my favorite texts on this topic, which I think is also on your handout, which is a Disputed Questions on Spiritual Creatures, question 1, response to the 12th objection. And Aquinas, who is normally a very straightforward, plain-speaking, ordinary kind of thinker, never inserts any drama into his text. This is one of the most surprising places in his text because he considers an almost insane kind of thought experiment. So he says, if a box were to exist by itself without matter, it would be self-thinking, for freedom from matter implies intellectuality. And hence, an immaterial box would be the same as an intelligible box. And so what he's asking you to do is to take a box, strip away the matter from the box until you're left with just immaterial box form. And if you have immaterial box form, what do you have? You have a thinking box. And you don't just have a thinking box, but you have a self-thinking box. You have a box-thinking box. That's what you've got. So the idea is that a form that exists by itself without matter is a kind of self-manifestation, right? So this is a very revealing thought experiment. Aquinas is describing something that would be like a Platonic form, a form that exists by itself immaterially. And he says that that kind of form would be intellectual, intelligible, and therefore essentially self-thinking, or manifest to itself through and through. On this account, all Platonic forms would be essentially manifest to themselves. So the Platonic form of beauty would be a beauty thought and also a beauty thinker. And of course, Aquinas does not think there are Platonic forms, but he does think that being a thought thinker is just what an angel is. And he thinks that this is the same kind of being that we acquire when we're thinking. Okay, so let me just summarize the position that I think Aquinas holds here, and it's this. There's a kind of being that is intrinsically lit up to itself, whose proper characteristic is to be self-manifesting. And an instance of this kind of being is nothing other than an episode of intellectual experience. To put it another way, there's a kind of being that's just intellectual consciousness. When we acquire it, we're acquiring intellectual consciousness, like water acquiring heat or skin acquiring redness. And once we have it, we can begin performing relevant intellectual actions. All right. Third section. So now I want to take this model of thinking as being and apply it more broadly to the idea of the kinds of activities mental activities that we perform when we're learning something, in order to make sense of the idea that thinking transforms us, or that we grow through knowing. So take Joe, a student of zoology. Every time Joe learns something new, let's say a new animal species, he's acquiring more self-manifesting being than he had before, which is just as real a growth as a sapling growing into trees, or a tree, or water acquiring more heat. So for Aquinas, when Joe graduates with his zoology degree, there is more of him than when he started. So in this last section, I want to unpack this idea of intellectual growth in more depth, because I think it helpfully rounds out the picture of how thinking in Aquinas is truly a kind of nature with its own internal dynamism. Indeed, it's a kind of life, continuous with the life of plants and animals. Aquinas quite frequently compares intellectual activity to various kinds of biological development and growth. But I just want to mention two interesting cases. There are many, many examples like this. Now, in one case, he states that when we compose more complex thoughts from simple ones, so think of the fact that you formulate a sentence like, wallabies are marsupials, right? You come to that judgment. He says that when we do that, we're assembling parts into a unified whole in just the way that Empedocles thought that by chance, individual animal parts first come to exist and then coalesce into a whole. You have this very trippy description from Empedocles here. So he says, quote, and this is also on your handout, Empedocles said that in the beginning, many heads were germinated without any necks. And similarly, many other parts of animals came to be separately from other parts. And afterwards, these divided parts were composed by concord, and from them there came to be one animal with diverse parts, such as head, hand, foot, and the like. And where an animal was constituted having all the parts necessary for its survival, then that same animal survived and generated things like itself. But if some of its parts were missing, it could not be saved, nor did it perpetuate its life through generation. Therefore, just as Empedocles posited that friendship composed many parts and constituted from them one animal, so too the intellect composes many simples that were previously separate and makes from them one known thing, and in which composition there is sometimes truth and sometimes falsity. It's a little bit wild. In a second set of texts, Aquinas compares the possibility of intellectual and moral error to the defectibility of natural processes. So we saw him comparing true propositions to the substances that have parts necessary to survive and reproduce, while false propositions are aligned with substances that have parts missing and are sterile. Elsewhere, he similarly compares false judgments to what he calls monsters, which are malformed organisms produced by glitches in the natural generative processes. And in an extensive discussion of evil in his commentary on the sentences, Aquinas interestingly offers a common explanation of why reasoning sometimes produces false conclusions and why biological processes sometimes result in malformed organisms. He says that the answer for both is that these activities are performed by agents that have actuality mixed with privation, limited creatures. And there's many other examples of this kind. So when we see comparisons like this in Aquinas between the mental and the biological, what should we make of them? And in light of Aquinas' theory of thinking as being, I propose that we need to take these analogies as substantive claims telling us what thinking actually does to our intellect. I think on his view, when we compose more complex thoughts and draw conclusions, our intellect is literally developing and reorganizing itself, which is to say it's growing. So let me unpack that in two steps. First, as I've been arguing, intelligibility is a real kind of being, then any arranging of intelligibles, if I compose wallaby and marsupial in the sentence, wallabies are marsupials, what I'm doing is arranging bits of real being. I'm doing something to being. And secondly, since intelligible being is intellectual being, as we saw in the last section, the arranging of these intelligible bits is actually an arranging of intellectual being, the being of my own intellect. So wallaby and marsupial are not just bits of content or mental terms, they are the very self-manifesting stuff of which an actualized intellect is made. So when I combine these two together, my intellect is rearranging itself. An episode of thought is rearranging itself. So that means that the human mind, when it's forming more complex thoughts, is not collecting and compiling bits of data as in a kind of information process model. Rather, it's organizing and reorganizing its own being. And self-development, of course, is the mark of the living. So how exactly the intellect rearranges itself is a longer story. I'm happy to talk to anybody about this who is interested, but it has to do with a kind of, ultimately, the way that the intellect makes itself into a kind of artifact that's in conformity with the whole of being, organized in the manner in which the genre and the species are organized, from the less determinate to the more determinate. So my proposal is that intellectuality is a kind of life, and that the actions of complex learning, like forming propositions, drawing conclusions of arguments, these are just the self-motions characteristic of living intellectual beings, our internal activities of self-development or growth towards the maturity of intellectual being. And what that means is that we're both passive and active in our intellectual development. First, we have to acquire intellectual being in the first place. But then this being begins to unfold and develop in us, like a plant growing. We do that. And just as a body's power increases along with its size, so Aquinas points out that bigger fires emit more heat, so too the intellect's power increases as it becomes structured by more and more forms. As Aquinas explains, he says, the more the soul receives, the more it can receive. The more the intellect knows difficult things, the more it can know. And in fact, the idea that intellect grows through learning should have been obvious to anyone paying attention to Aquinas' notion of second nature. Virtue ethicists, ancient and modern, have long accepted that character is a real part of us, something that we can actively grow and develop. Through our practical choices, we literally develop into virtuous or vicious people in the way that a sapling grows into a healthy or stunted tree. We acquire expanded capacities which become a second nature. So most readers of Aquinas would surely not hesitate to describe character-building acts quite literally as moral growth, the teleological progress of a human being from an undeveloped or stunted moral condition into a more beautiful and perfected condition. And I'm proposing that we need to say the same thing of our intellectual life. Our intellectual life is intellect building. It unfolds and expands intellectual being in us towards a more perfect state of second nature. So let me make a final point in conclusion. What is the end goal of all of this intellectual growing? For Aquinas, the mature shape toward which intellectual being aims is a complete assimilation to the whole of being. And that's just what he calls truth, or the conformity or adequation of thing and intellect. When we organize our thoughts, we're like a tree that unfolds branches out from its immature structure into a mature structure. And this is an idea that puts Aquinas squarely in line with the Arabic philosophical tradition, Avicenna and Averroes, and even with his teacher Albert. Nonetheless, Aquinas is more pessimistic than those predecessors about the possibility of our completing in this lifetime the full trajectory of intellectual growth towards complete conformity to all being. So he says, this is the last quote on your handout, "The human intellect is from the beginning like a tablet on which nothing is written. Only afterwards does it receive forms in a certain order, nor is it ever filled up in this life." End quote. For Aquinas, then, reaching the mature shape of all being is not a concretely achievable goal of intellectual life, but only a theoretical horizon toward which our scientific studies aim. Human thought, then, is a living nature that can only finish unfurling in the next life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Therese, for that just masterful talk. I confess that I lost the thread for just a minute. I got transported into this kind of imaginative fantasy of the self-thinking podium, which was just wonderful. So thank you for drawing attention to that amazing text from Aquinas, which I'd never seen before and will never forget, I think. So we have a few minutes for questions, and I'll moderate. I'll just note that the session is being recorded, so your brilliant insights will live on to posterity. But the floor really is open for questions from anybody. So I'll point, and then somebody will bring a handheld microphone to you, and Therese, I'll invite you back up to handle the questions. Deb? Deb? Oh, yeah. Here we go.
Yeah, so I got a bit fixated on the box too. So in the long tradition of thinking about objective being or objective reality, the reality that things have in the intellect that enables them to be thought of, but it's not like real being, right? So, the sun in the intellect is not like the sun in the heavens, blah, 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 blah. And, and one of the kind of metaphors this wasn't really a metaphor, I guess they thought that mirrors had objective beings in them. Yeah. But that didn't go along with self-consciousness.
Right.
And so it would be bizarre to think, that the object in the mirror is literally aware of itself, or anything is aware of anything in the mirror. Yep. So the idea would be that the objective reality of the thing has to be somehow connected to the intellect. And there's a bit of a puzzle there, right? Because if the objective reality just is the form in the intellect, and that's not really distinct from the form in the real thing in the world, but the objective reality is also not really distinct from the intellect, then you get this problem of transitivity, right?
Right.
What makes the intellect
Yep.
really distinct from the thing, right?
Yep.
Does the mind become literally the sun, through that? So, so I guess my question is, first of all, what to make, what to say about the box? Is it really, would it really be self-conscious? Is the object in the mirror really, is there self-consciousness there? And then what to say about that problem of transitivity? Namely, how do we preserve that distinction between the mind and the world? So you were very focused on getting the mind-world meld going, and I really appreciate that, but there is also that problem on the other side, how to maintain the relevant distinctions as well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great, and also very important to bring in the concept of objective being, because I think that development, which goes back to Henry of Ghent, and then gets widespread through readers of Descartes, is in a way, that's the approach to reading Aquinas that I want to argue against, because this dichotomy between objective being and the being that the form has in reality or in re or something like that, that distinction doesn't line up with Aquinas' distinction between natural being and intellectual being. So I think for him, intellectual being is its own kind of nature, and it's necessarily incorporeal. So a reflection in a mirror is not going to be intellectual being. It's not even going to be sensible being or imaginative being. It's going to be the form in another kind of matter, but it's not going to have any of these characteristics of this other kind of genus that he wants to set aside for thought, or then also ceteris paribus for sensible being. And so what that does is it means that then we're kind of in a different universe when we're trying to answer the question of what's the relationship between the being of thought and, say, the being of the wallaby, right, that exists in dimensions and is living and hopping around. And we don't need to make some sort of, I think we shouldn't, when we read Aquinas, posit some sort of identification between the form of intellectual being and the form in the wallaby. The way we should think about it is rather that for him, on a general theory of likeness, there's always a possibility for something that has being at a certain level or in a certain genus to cause a likeness of itself in another being. So a key example of this would be the sun, which is a celestial incorporeal entity. It's not hot, but it has something in it that causes the form of heat, which is a likeness of something in the sun. So you've got these two kinds of being, right, which don't have any overlap at all. They belong to two different genres, but one causes the other. And so there's a kind of likeness between them. And I think that's the way that he thinks about natural being, or sometimes he calls it natural being, we say material being, the being of the wallaby in its living condition, and my wallaby thought. These are two different kinds of being, one in one order causing being in the other order. And because of this causal relationship, there's a likeness of one to the other, but there's not anything special about that likeness. It's not like a representation. It's not a vehicle for content. Doesn't have an intentional relation back. So it's just two kinds of being. One being causes the other kind of being. But I think that's the way we're supposed to think about it for Aquinas. This one here.
Thanks very much. I'm curious about whether it is true to say that mind is in nature or it is in life, because I feel like they're mixing metaphors here. On the one hand, we've got growth and development, and you talk a lot about the plant, and then on the other hand, you talk about increase in size, which is not necessarily a living process, but it does apply to non-living beings, right? Also, there is the question that passage from Empedocles sounds like these things just exist prior to the whole, but of course in a tree the leaves don't pre-exist the whole. There's a kind of a simultaneity between the tree and its parts that is unique to living beings, right?
Yeah.
So which one is it? Because I think, the distinction between life and non-living, living and non-living comes later, and it's a more modern distinction, but is there a claim here about mind and life, or is it mind and nature? And if it is the latter, about nature, then how does he understand non-living being? And is he maybe not conceptualizing life in the way that we conceptualize life?
Right, so yes, that's a very good point, particularly because Aquinas is not always, he doesn't standardize his terminology in the way that we would like. So sometimes he'll use the term nature in one way, and then sometimes he'll use it in another way. So sometimes he talks about, and this is the thing I think that has confused many readers and made sort of motivated thinking of him as someone who puts mind outside the realm of nature. He'll use the language of nature, talk about natural being, to talk about material things. So he does do that sometimes. But then he also has another broader notion of nature as from the Aristotelian tradition as anything that has an internal principle of motion and change. And in that sense of nature, that applies to sensation, it applies to thought. And there's even, and then this is this kind of a complicated story because this intersects with another concept of life that he gets from the Neoplatonic tradition, where you have this triad of being, life, and intelligence, where life is a perfective category, that's something that belongs to God primarily, and then to other things derivatively. So that's not a concept of biological life at all. It has to do much more with agency or vitality in the sense of dynamism, but not in the sense of change necessarily. So he's playing with all of these different concepts, and I think where he ends up himself is that he wants to think about intellect as a kind of nature, not in the sense that it has the same kinds of motions and changes that go on in the material world, because those are proper to the kinds of things that are changing. So it's going to have its own kinds of changes, but it does actually change. And so in that sense, it has something in common with a purely biological notion of life. But if we look sort of at intellect in relation to what's above it, right, with this more Neoplatonic notion of life, then what we have is some kind of notion of agency and dynamism, right? That thinking is a kind of perfection that doesn't necessarily have to change anything. It could just be, contemplation could just be the perfection that you have. And then that's a sense of life that puts us in continuity with the divine life, which is just this sort of perpetual act of contemplation. So I think he's operating with both of those concepts of life at the same time. Yeah.
Question over here.
Thank you very much for that. That was a very interesting talk, and probably I didn't get most of it. But one of the things that came to me, I suppose, and maybe these were issues raised by the previous two questions, I guess it seems the logic that everything material that can be known has a form, instantiates a form. That form, therefore, is potentially at least self-manifesting.
Right.
It therefore seems to say that the potential of everything is able to be self-manifesting and consequently both be intelligible and intellectual. My question then is, in what way, if any, does that distinguish, perhaps where you're going, from people like Ray Kurzweil and the idea of the singularity? That is, the idea that through our technology, we so work upon materiality that we can inform it with intelligence. And consequently, people like Galen Strawson, for example, actually argue more and more for panpsychism. And I guess that's my feeling is, do you feel anything that might be a temptation within that to kind of pantheism, or in a weak form, panpsychism?
Right, so I think this is a very important problem here, actually, because the way that you describe it, that every form is potentially self-manifesting, that's exactly right. That is, I think, Aquinas' view. Any enmattered form, if it could become disenmattered, would be self-manifesting, so every form is potentially self-manifesting. And what that means is that for Aquinas, we have to explain, the thing that we need to explain in a way is why all forms aren't self-manifesting. Because the default is for form to be self-manifesting. That's how it is in God, that's how it is in angels, that's how it is in our thoughts. And then all of a sudden, but we look around at the material natures and we discover there's all these forms and they're not self-manifesting. So why is that? And there's a few texts where he talks about materiality as a block to self-manifestation. So because materiality spreads out the form in 3 dimensions, it prevents the form from being fully self-possessing or fully lit up to itself in the way that it needs to be self-manifesting. So materiality is this kind of obstacle. So what that means is I think Aquinas shares some of the same insights that lead people to endorse panpsychism. There's a sense that the forms of things are somehow very, very close to thought, or the forms of things could be thoughts. But he doesn't think that they're thoughts in their enmattered states. They're only thoughts as intellectual forms in us. So for him, he would put this sort of the other way around, where you talked about working on material realities and imbuing them with intelligence. He actually sort of sees it the other way around, where the things around us act on us, and they imbue us with intelligence by causing their forms in us. But they cause their forms as intellectual forms in us. And so what they're causing is thoughts. And so it's a picture in which the whole of reality is pressing in on us, transforming us. And then we have some agency in what we can make of that thought that we've acquired in arranging it in various ways. But not a picture where we can sort of push it in the other direction and put our thoughts into things.
And we have time for another question. Yes, over here.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the intellectual exercise. And this might be a naive question, but I'm wondering how, within your context, do you explain distorted thought?
Yes, so this is for Aquinas a product of the fact that when we're doing these acts of self-organizing, just in a way, our thought is like a human artifact. It's something that we're building up inside ourselves at all times when we're thinking and judging and reasoning. And when we do that, just like when we make any artifact, we can use the techniques badly or we can use the techniques well. And so what happens is we've used the techniques of thought badly, and then what we end up with is a false proposition, we end up with an argument that's invalid, and all of those are sort of misformations of the intellectual being that we're curating, basically. So that's the picture, and luckily those are misformations that can be undone. So they're never set in stone, but they're the result of the fact that as creatures, we're not guaranteed to be able to use our natural capacities with 100% accuracy at all times. Yeah.
And so the perfected thought is guided by God,
when you're remedying the infected thought?
Yes, or how, yes.
Yeah, so
the judgment made about the distorted thought, yeah.
Right, so a variety of things could happen. So Aquinas has a role for teaching. Basically what's happening with teaching is that the teacher is directing the attention of the student in such a way that they're able to use their natural capacities better. So a teacher could correct the defective thought, or prompt the student to do their own activity of correcting the defective thought. You can't actually do the work for the student in this picture. There could be Aquinas leaves the possibility open of a correction of distorted thinking by divine revelation. And that would be like a divine illumination in the mind that would allow the mind to then see what went wrong and reorganize in a better way. So there's a variety of possibilities there, or somebody could just notice it themselves. They might notice that something else that they said is not consistent with that thing, and then they have to think about which one of them is the malformation. So yeah, all the standard ways.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. I'm now going to invite Will Taylor, who's a PhD student here at Notre Dame, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, David. Indeed, on behalf of the University of Notre Dame, I would like to thank Dr. Therese Cory for her unquestionably thought-provoking talk this evening. Notre Dame Centre for the History of Philosophy could hardly have asked for more at its launch lecture, and hopefully it's a sign of things to come for the enterprise. I had the pleasure of meeting Therese on Thursday and of accompanying her to her first trip to the Sydney Opera House, and I can assure you that she's as friendly and personable as her lectures are stimulating and rich in content. It felt equally natural talking with her about things as ordinary as the extremes of North American weather and her dabblings in piano, as it did talking about things as high-flown and abstract about Aristotle and Aquinas on form. And I think that's what's been particularly interesting and valuable in her talk today, and the ability to take the abstract, the highly theoretical, and integrate it with the everyday, something that I think we here in Australia value a fair bit. Particularly interesting, at least to me, was the treatment of mental life as on par with natural being, as analogical with a physical analysis of change, something that might be at least initially a bit abstract and foreign to us. And then using this to explain some of those common metaphors of life, intellectual growth, moral growth, and so on, in a way that is illuminating for understanding oneself and for the way we treat ourselves and potentially treat others. I really value that in a philosophy, and so again, thank you, Therese, for your lecture this evening. Indeed, we're all extremely grateful for your being here today, for being able to learn from someone as distinguished as yourself, and for launching the Centre for the History of Philosophy here at Notre Dame, and thus we would like to express our appreciation with this small gift. Thank you very much for being with us here tonight.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Therese, for your wonderful talk this evening. So it just remains for me to thank all of you for joining us here at the university and to invite you now for some drinks and refreshments. Thank you.